All right, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us today for Missouri Humanities Virtual Capacity Building Workshop on Community Conversations. Today's presentation is being presented by GK Callahan and Leticia Johnson. This workshop will guide participants through a Community Conversations Toolkit, providing an overview of how and why to organize successful public engagement events. Both GK and Leticia are MU Extension field faculty members. GK is the Urban West Engagement Specialist, and Leticia is the Community Development Specialist in Mid Missouri. As usual with our webinars, if you have questions throughout, go ahead and put those in the chat or the Q&A, and I will go ahead and pass it off to Leticia and GK.
Okay, good afternoon, everyone. You can call me Tish. That's a lot easier to deal with. GK and I have been with Extension a long time, and when I think about community conversations and how we approach those, especially more creative options, I think of GK Callahan. So I'm very happy that he's here with us today.
Thanks,
So
Tish.
we're gonna talk about two different broad approaches. Conventional community conversations and what those are about, that may be what you're more familiar with, and then some creative approaches and how to inject some creativity into your community conversations. So I hope you're really going to enjoy this today. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about community conversations in general and why they are important in our community efforts. So let's talk about conventional community conversations, the kind of events where we come together in a room with chairs, possibly tables, to have a conversation. What sort of things do we consider a part of a conventional community conversation? So one of the things that's really important is to have a very clear purpose and goals for our meeting, not just let's get together and talk about it. What is it that we want to convey to people we are coming together to talk about so that they'll be motivated to attend and participate? And then what is it as organizers that we really want to come away with from this meeting? Do we want a set of ideas? Do we want some, I'm getting a spam call, can you believe it? We always start with the end in mind, right? One of the Stephen Covey things, I think. Our conversations should be structured and focused. So let's keep it clear. So if you are facilitating that discussion, let's not, we talk about kitchen sink syndrome, where what about all the whatabouts? What about this? We're going to come together and we're going to talk about, let's say we're going to talk about sidewalk in this particular area of town. Do we need sidewalks? Where are we going to put them? That sort of thing. And it's like, what about the water system? Now, we're not going to go there. So having a strategy for how you're going to deal with any of those side issues that come up can be really helpful. We'll talk about a parking lot sometimes. That's important. We'll acknowledge it. That's important. It should be talked about, but let's focus on this right now. If you can have an agenda for people so that they are very clear what we're talking about. I don't like to put times on my agenda personally, because I think that gets people watching the clock, but that's just a general tip there. It's important for a conversation to have a wide range of voices from different backgrounds, different perspectives on the issue. Just because you know someone is anti whatever you're trying to do is not necessarily a reason to not include them. I used to have a person, I worked in a county where the population was gathered along one of the borders. It was a river county. And I had a guy on the other side of the county who would give me grief periodically about not holding meetings in that part of the county where there were no locations. And I finally got smart enough to invite him to join our group and bring his voice to the table. And he became very helpful, very agreeable. in helping us reach that part of the county. And he even made cookies for some of the meetings. So it's really important to bring in all those other perspectives. Having a format that allows everyone to weigh in, to share their perspectives, their concerns, their ideas, without controlling the agenda, without overbearing. Some strategies you can use around that. You can hand out small pieces of paper and pens and ask people to write down their questions, write down their ideas. Especially useful in an environment where there's low trust and people may not feel like they want to speak up. But finding some way of thinking about who's coming, who you want to come, and how are we going to allow everyone to participate in a way that's manageable. If you have access to a skilled facilitator, sometimes it's better to use somebody who is not directly a part of your group, because you may be perceived as having a particular agenda. You know, we want you to agree to do this. But whoever your facilitator is, it's important that that person makes sure that everyone gets a chance to speak and that no one voice, no one perspective dominates. Sometimes that might mean asking people to raise their hands. It might mean asking people, if you've got a really out of control group, sometimes we'll put people, even without planning ahead, into small groups to discuss a question and then report back to break up a particular clique that's happening or that's dominating. Facilitators should make sure that we're having respectful conversation. We're not lobbying insults. We're not, I mean, that can't be tolerated. We're not bringing up that one time you did this one thing. That is not relevant to this discussion. If you want to talk about that, let's have a conversation about that after this event. And then keeping that conversation on track. Again, going back to those goals. What is the purpose of this conversation? And what is it that we're looking to achieve? And sometimes that facilitator may need to bring us back, so that I think one of the greatest skills a facilitator can have is simply being able to summarize where we're at and then ask a question to move us forward. So I'm hearing three options, A, B, and C. You know, what's the next step? How do we move forward on this? Okay, GK. So why would we hold? What are the purposes of a community conversation? Why do we want to start one? One of the most common is around, we want to gather information or use it for a plan. So we may be gathering ideas or input. We have this vacant building. We're not sure what we want to do with it. Let's get some people together, get some ideas. And when you do that, you will discover opportunities. And I'll talk more about that in a minute. Maybe we want to share information and get some feedback on some decision points. This is where we're at in the project. This is what we've accomplished so far. These are some of the things moving forward. This can really help build trust in the community and get you some valuable information. Some problem solving. We've got this issue. We have this creek that's full of trash, it's overgrown with weeds, it keeps flooding. What are some options? We don't just have money to throw at it. What might we do with this? So having a way of solving a problem, and GK is going to talk about some creative approaches to that later on. Addressing a community concern or an opportunity. Hey, we've got this business that's looking to locate here, or they're looking to hold this big event. What do we do to bring that into the community? Or there's this trend that data is showing. A trend is one of the hardest things to mobilize people around because they sneak up on you. And we may want to talk about, you know, our community is getting older and older, and that's going to mean changes in what we need in the way of resources and infrastructure. Let's pull some interested people together and have a conversation around that. How do we prepare now for where we're going? And then this is an important one, clarifying or resolving some specific points of confusion or misinformation. Now, I know all of you, this never, ever, ever happens in your community, right? Rumors never start. People don't get confused. People don't get upset about something because they believe, even GK's laughing. They don't get confused about what's happening around something. Be open, be transparent, open it up and say, come ask your questions. Let's correct the misinformation that's out there. Let's make sure everybody's on the same point. The more open and transparent you are in these things, it will only work in your favor to build trust. And the reason trust is so critical is because without trust, there is no compromise. Without trust, you've got everyone battling to win, right? My side has to win. Opening up communication, having a transparent process doesn't mean everybody gets to do absolutely everything, but being very open about it will really help move things forward in the long run. All right. So I wanted to give you a few examples of how we've used this in extension in a more conventional approach. We started with, in St. Genevieve County, a number of years ago, with the issue of that you've probably heard before, we need something for our youth to do. Through a series of community conversations, we started with a survey that the youth did. It wasn't a research rigorous survey, but it was certainly a talking point. It gave us something to start with. And as we began talking as a group, and we opened these meetings up to absolutely everybody, we had an organizing group. We didn't close that organizing group. We said that our steering committee was about 300 people because we didn't want to limit it. This was a low trust situation coming out of some natural disasters. But through that process, we identified some additional opportunities to expand and move this project forward. What I started with my very first day on this, thinking that we would create, is not at all what we ended up with. And we have to be open to that. It became this set of nested projects. For example, at one of our meetings, somebody said, well, you know, the library has been saving money for 20 years to build a new library, and they've raised X amount of dollars, but they've got a long way to go. So fast forward, and we talked with them and said, what if we build part of this community center into a new library, and we expand the space, and we do this and we do that, and we add computer kiosks, and you give us your money that you've saved. So there were all kinds of those things that came out through these community conversations. Wholesome Cement was a new major employer. Wholesome Cement is this particular facility is the largest in the world, but it's not that big. It just turns out cement manufacturing doesn't have the huge footprint we imagine it will. But when they were proposing creating this cement plant along the Mississippi River, there were a lot of environmental concerns, there were financial concerns, economic concerns, and a lot of rumors and misinformation out there. And one of those areas of confusion had to do with the TIF district, the tax increment financing district. Details of that don't matter. The idea was how much money would come back to the county and to the taxing entities within the county, like the school board. So it turned into sort of this big mess. And so we called a town hall type meeting, opened it up to everybody, and I facilitated it. I set times for how long everybody could speak, and worked out just trying to bring out the correct information. So this is an example of correcting misinformation, finding common ground, just allowing all of those voices and yet controlling how much time each one had so no one voice dominated. Doe Run, you may be familiar with some of the concerns at Doe Run. They have had a lead smelter operating in Herculaneum, which is Jefferson County, just south of St. Louis. They operated that for many years, and lead residue got literally all over this community. So the EPA came in and brought us in to help facilitate some community conversations because they knew that as the EPA, they would not be seen as objective. And so we needed to help gather information from the community about their experience, what they knew about. Sometimes in these scenarios, you get the experts saying, well, this is what's happening, and the people on the ground saying, no, this is what's happening. So our job was to kind of broker that and have that communication so that we could have some positive actions for this community and to clean up this community while there were families living there. All right, GK.
I
So
guess
why don't you?
this is my cue. So
Yes.
when we have a joke in community development that, we always run around with post-it notes and stickers and we couldn't do our job without them. And so, I put up this picture of post-it notes because what I really want to talk about is more creative approaches to community conversations or sort of unconventional outside the box sort of ways that you might be able to structure community conversations. These formats, well, let me back up. I'd like to introduce, I have this community arts safety manual that I've been working on and off for a few years. And it's really got the 10 things I think are important when you're going to tackle a large community project. There are things like listening and building trust. And I'm going to do a deep dive into some of the things that I think are really important to community conversations here in just a minute. But after looking at this and reviewing it with Tish, we found that really the most critical thing that I think is often overlooked are these soft skills. And to host and facilitate a really successful community conversation, or in my vantage point, any sort of community project, you really need to focus and be considerate of those soft skills. So your soft skills are things like how you communicate, how you have teamwork, your problem solving, time management, leadership. Interpersonal skills are really important. We're talking about community, not individuals. And then, of course, my favorite, creativity. So, some key actionable items from my toolkit that I think are important for you guys to note are I think it's really helpful to spend extra time, and we're going to do a deep dive into this first one, but crafting an invitation. How are you either inviting yourself to the table or inviting your community members or other communities to the table with you? I think that's the first step in getting things right. And how you go about crafting that invitation and setting that up can make and break a project or a conversation with people in your local area. It's also really important, I think, to follow local protocol. And what I mean by this is every community around the world, small and large, in your neighborhood, probably has their own way that they conduct their way of life. And it can be something as simple as not wearing your hat at the dinner table when you go to have a community conversation. I know that sounds like a Miss Manners thing, but that can be enough just to turn someone off and make them change their perspective on you. And so just understanding what that local protocol is, how you, how you should dress appropriately, or are you overdressed to set the conversation off at a wrong start? I put it takes time. This in this context of a community conversation, this is really around building trust. Tish touched on that earlier, but trust is not built overnight. It takes a lot of time, and community conversations can be a first step in that. But I also think it's important to understand that trust can be lost and broken in seconds. And so, really understanding that sometimes one community conversation is not enough. That if you're really tackling a large project or a heavy subject like lead in your community or in your water, that it's going to take time to get through that and to work with people. These are listening and letting go of control, and I put them together for a reason. It's really important to understand, especially if you're facilitating a community conversation, you are there to listen. And part of that listening means you have to let go of control to the community members who want to speak. They want their voices heard. It's also their community. So even if you're part of that community, you have to understand it's a shared space and a shared experience. Facilitating and keeping people on track is different than having control and not listening, right? And so you need to understand it's a fine line, but those are something you should really pay attention to. And then another thing that I think is always fun is the role of play. I think that people often don't think about how much play helps with interpersonal relationships and skills. And it's really important. A lot of people hate, oh, I don't want to do that icebreaker. This is a silly game. And then by the end of it, they're laughing together. They're talking about it remind them of a childhood or their kids played this or, and so there's some bonding going on. Play can also be really important when a community has to come together around a tough issue. Maybe it's high breast cancer rates, or again, back to lead in your water. And just interjecting a little play might be something that people are missing, and it might help enlighten the mood enough that you can actually have a productive conversation. So those are just some top points I think you need to think about. So I'll give you some examples of some creative projects that I've had, creative community conversations. The first one was a continuation of a decade-long HIV/AIDS awareness project. And I went to Africa to work with a group of women called the Zakana women in Tanzania. And I went there to have a community conversation about their perspective around HIV and AIDS and how that's different than the American perspective that I've held. And it was a wonderful project, and it ended up being very successful. But what was really important was how I crafted that invitation to come to their community and have this conversation. I think, there's some very blatant things that I hope you can see right off the bat. I'm a white male. These are Black women in Africa. It was not my country. It's not my space. And I wanted to have this dialogue, but I wanted to do it in a way that didn't endanger them, didn't, misrepresent them. And so I think crafting that invitation was really important. And I worked with several nonprofits to help me craft that invitation, and then worked with several community members of color before I went there to make sure that my invitation and the way I was approaching the conversation was respectful and poignant to my goals. Also following local protocols. So this is one of my favorite stories to tell. I get to Africa and I'm super excited, and it's the day we're going to go meet the women. I'd been there for like a day and a half, and we go to this spot, and the women are like behind a curtain over there. They're making paper and working on their craft, and I'm a boisterous American, and so I'm so excited to run up and just introduce myself. And one of my local guides, the gentleman in the picture there with the Hawaiian shirt, Seppo, he pulls me aside and he says, "You have to wait. As a male, you can't just go approach them. You got to get permission from the church leader and the church's wife first." And that they weren't in. And so I had to sit there for a very long length of time looking at these women that I flew all the way around the world to approach, but I couldn't approach them because it would have broken the protocol. And if I would have broken the protocol, the minister would have said no, and the whole trip would have been ruined. And so it's really important to find someone local, especially if it's not your community, to understand the landscape and what those protocols are. The Please Touch Garden was one of my longest running projects that I worked on. What's neat about this being a community conversation is I built a garden space on a vacant lot with people with disabilities, maybe mainly visual disabilities, in partnership with the Lighthouse for the Blind in San Francisco, California. So the space itself became the community conversation. Every time new people, the lot was open to the public, people came there for lunch. But when they came on that space, it was all about having a conversation about what people with disabilities could accomplish and how they also have a purpose to give back and contribute to society. They don't just need to be taken care of. And so it's a different way to reframe a community conversation. It's less a direct approach of people sitting in a circle and more about building this environment that becomes the community conversation. One of the lessons here was about it takes time. Not only did it take time to earn the trust of the Lighthouse and its participants to go with me on this crazy journey to build this huge community space, but I wrote a grant for this project. And between receiving the grant and stepping foot on the lot, a year happened. And a year happened to deal with the bureaucracy and the red tape that it took to get the permission and the lawyers and things. And so I just think you should always keep in mind when you're tackling bigger issues and you're having these community conversations that sometimes there's hiccups in there that may take time and may spread that out. I also think this was a really good lesson on listening and letting go of control. I, as an able-bodied person, had this idea and vision for the space. And I had a way that I thought it was going to be constructed, set up, and ran. And during the building and the construction, that shifted dramatically because people who I wanted to build the space with and it being used as a tool to host these community conversations needed to let me know that my vision didn't always fit their abilities. And so I had to step back and listen. I had to let go of my original plan, let go of some control, and work with them to create the space that really ended up being a success. The last project I'm going to share with you as an example is really fun. It's called Sound Letters from San Francisco. And I was working with a fellow artist out of Ireland, and we both happened to be working within the blind community at the time. And they wanted to talk about their community and what different struggles they had with people around the world being blind. They wanted to have this sort of conversation. And so instead of just doing a Zoom call or a voice memo or something, we decided to use sort of like a snail mail voice memo. So we would have the participants would sign up and they would record a voice memo to their counterparts in Ireland. And then we would send that off. And that the next session, so this was once a week, we would listen to the Irish response. And so they had to wait their turn and go back and forth with this. So these sound letters were exchanged back and forth, but it was a way of using play. We could have gotten them all on a video call and they could have just chatted, but it just made it more exciting. It gave them really something to look forward to. And, it really helped them hone what they wanted to say in their short amount of time. And so it was a way to use play as to structure the conversation. So back to invitations. There's some major things to consider. And the reason why I stick on this one point is I think, like I said earlier, this can be the make or break of how well your event or your community conversation goes. So first thing is you want to speak in a language that resonates, right? You want to make sure that the community understands what you're trying to get at, and not just being clear and concise, but that you're not being overly academic or using slang or a jargon that turns people off or people don't understand. And so that's the first thing to think about when approaching an invitation. You want to make sure your invitation reaches everyone. And, some of these things are obvious, right? So you have some visual aids, you might have braille or large print for, people who are elderly or have visual problems. But really, a lot of things we talk about in the modern age is what's their digital accessibility? Does everyone have the internet? Oh, just put it on Facebook. They'll all come. Well, maybe people don't use Facebook. Maybe the younger crowd doesn't use it, right? And so you need to think about how you're inviting people to the table and how accessible your invitations are. Who are the leaders in that community that you're trying to have this conversation or dialogue with? Because one of the biggest things with the community conversation is trying to build trust among your neighbors and your peers. And if you have the endorsement of certain community leaders, that lends a long way into building trust. And helps open doors and just helps your facilitation go a lot smoother. It sometimes can make people feel safe as well. You might have a situation where you're dealing with people who don't speak English as their first language, and having a community leader there or a translator might help them feel more comfortable to share their thoughts, needs, or desires around the subject. And again, I know I've said this several times, but spending time listening to a community needs and concerns is really important. I think as a facilitator or a group who's hosting or putting on a community conversation, you really want to show that you're there to learn and not impose, because this can be really easily switched. So a big thing to think about is the hero complex or the savior complex. And this is sometimes this happens on accident, and it's by no fault of yours. But if you consider this ahead of time before the conversations, there's some things that you can avoid to not take this stance. So you need to design, you can't design without input. So again, like I talked about with the garden space, having this design laid out and thinking this is going to be what's going to work best for a community that I'm not part of would be designing without input. And so if you do start that way, stepping back and taking the time to listen and letting go of some control is a way you can sort of fix this. Portraying a community as a victim. We want to help those people. Those people over there need our X, Y, and Z. You don't want to assume that you understand how people feel about their own autonomy, their own space, their own community, and you really don't want to portray them as a victim in these conversations. You don't want to give out solutions without understanding the context. So just because you think that you have the best way to do something, and even if it might be a better way to do it, it doesn't mean that it's going to be necessarily appropriate for that community or that situation. It could be financially out of reach for those community members. It could be a situation that doesn't fit their local protocol, their local, environment. And so you just need to understand that you can't just give solutions without understanding. Um, this is a big one, and I actually have this as one of my bullet points in my toolkit. I call it don't create a gap. But you want to make sure that your community project is not just temporary and has a sort of lasting impact. So when you're doing these conversations, if it's just a one-off conversation, you need to be sure that if you say, I'm going to follow up with the results, that you do follow up, right? Because that can break trust. So you need to understand that if you ask people their opinion and then don't do anything with it, you need to at least explain why you're not going to do anything with it. What's the point? They gave you their time to come and have these conversations and tell you their needs. And so you just need to make sure that you're structuring things to have a lasting impact. And lastly, you don't want to frame things as a hero. You don't want to come in and think, well, I know better. I have money. I'm going to fix this thing. I'm going to come in and save the day. All these people over there need me because I know what's best. That's a really bad approach to start a community conversation and probably won't make you a lot of friends. I forgot there's two more, so I said last one, but I fibbed. I apologize. Again, you don't want to overlook local expertise. This might be finding that community leader, but it might be that, and Tish and I were talking about this. She's got a situation where there's a number of master naturalists. And I think because they're constantly in boots with, overalls and they're covered in hay or plant material, that people think that they're not as intelligent as they might be. And one of her master naturalists is the guy who put the Mars rover on Mars. And so understanding that there's local experience there and there's local talent in the room, and your perception of that might be different than what the reality is. And so you need to try to make sure you're not overlooking any local experience or expertise. And then the most important, you want to not tokenize community members when you're inviting people to your community conversation. And this can be like, oh, hey, did we invite that one guy? I think you understand. And you want to make sure that when you're including different community members, that you don't just have one person to represent a whole body of a community. You need to really work harder at not tokenizing folks. So those are some things that I think you should avoid, especially when crafting your invitation and getting people around the table. I want to talk about just a couple more examples of some creative community projects. Let me check the time here really quick. We're going very quickly. So the University of Missouri has a theater program, and they have an applied theater program, and it's called the Theater of the Oppressed. What's really great about this, especially for my Missouri listeners, which I think most of you are, is this is something that you can actually reach out to the university and bring to your community. We did it a few years ago here in Independence, Missouri, where I am, at a Habitat for Humanity that built their new offices in an old school that was used to be a segregated school. And they wanted to have a conversation around race and equity and diversity. So this theater group comes in and they have sort of canned plays and performances around these topics. They have it around topics like breast cancer and farm succession and a myriad of other things. But the actors act out a short play, and then they ask the audience how they felt about the play and if they would like to participate in the play and maybe change some of the outcomes. And they slowly bring audience members into the play, and then they do the play again. And then there's a part where they can even do it sometimes a third time, and you can pause them and rewind and try to get them to change the outcome of what's happening, and the community members become more and more involved in this act. And next thing you know, everyone's having this community conversation. And then at the end, the actors sit around in character and they respond to the community in character, and it really makes a really dynamic, interesting community conversation that feels less structured than sticky notes. And it's something that I would highly recommend looking more into if you have a tough situation that you need to tackle. They will also write plays for you, but it is quite expensive if you don't use one of their canned performances. Go ahead, Tish.
Does the term theater of the oppressed come from?
Theater of the Oppressed comes from a Brazilian professor, and he was a playwright. And I don't know why he called it Theater of the Oppressed, to be honest, but that it comes from Brazil. And we at Mizzou, they've been teaching it for a number of years. It's often sometimes called verbatim theater. I've used it before in the past. I had a project that was another project that was addressing HIV and AIDS in America called Contracting an Issue, and I would host a myriad of community conversations and interviews and techniques, and then I would write a play using the words that real people, real experiences happened. And then I would give those dialogues to actors to help protect the anonymity of the people who participated in my community conversations and in my research. And then they would go act those plays out in public spaces. So they were having real dialogue and real conversation from real people, but they were protected through the actors. And so, that's how they kept their anonymity. And so that's one other example of, verbatim theater or theater of the oppressed. So before I die, this is one of my favorite projects. I don't know how often I talk about this. It's from a lovely artist, and we have a short clip I think we're going to have time to show you here. But her name is Candy Chang. The clip we're going to show is on a different project, but this project is really interesting. She's a New Orleans-based artist, and she lived in a neighborhood that was heavily damaged by Hurricane Katrina. And during the time, she had lost a loved one and she was really having trouble grieving. And she wanted to understand how to better connect with her neighbors about their needs and wants. How do you better share resources without knocking on someone's door at an inappropriate time? How do you understand what they want to see for the neighborhood as it redevelops? And so she got with a group of friends and put chalkboard walls all around this building and then stenciled "Before I Die" and left out chalk. And it was her way of engaging with the neighborhood and the neighborhood engaging with each other. And it was very informal. And so people felt very open. Of course, she got some silly responses. I think in the video, I saw that one of the persons said, "Before I die, I want to be tried as a pirate." I mean, there was a lot of funny things in there, but she got some really interesting responses about, their hopes and dreams about how they wanted to leave their lovers or their parents, or what they wanted to see for their community going forward. And so I bring this up as an example because it became so popular. It was shown in like 28 different countries. She created a toolkit that you can download and you can build one of these in your own community. But it's a really unconventional way to have a community conversation on a large scale without having people to all show up and sit around in chairs with post-it notes. So it's just something completely different. Before we transition to the video, I think I'm going to take a quick breath here, and we'd like you to write in the chat um, maybe some things that you've learned today, or if you have any questions about any of the projects. I know it's a little difficult because we can't converse back and forth, but we'd like to hear from you just for a minute. So I'm going to leave a little bit of space here to see if anyone has anything they want to put in the chat.
I think what GK are doing is within the limitations of a webinar, you don't have microphones to pitch in, but we do want to be inclusive. We want to hear other voices, and you have your experiences and your expertise in your communities. So as you have participated in community conversations of different types, and we hope this has gotten your wheels turning about what those look like, what did you find were some keys to success? What were those lessons learned? And they're starting to come in here. that you want to share with each other. And then we also would like to know, so that GK and I continuing the work on his toolkit, what resonated with you out of this short conversation today? It's not really we're trying to make it more of a conversation by using chat instead of just a traditional presentation. So I'm getting a few responses here. Oh, that's kind words. Thank you about that. I would know what I would say, Connie, is that GK I aren't necessarily experts. We are, as community development educators, we are facilitators. We are people that try to focus on the process and help make things happen. And I'm willing to bet GK is going to agree with me that we learn a lot every single time we
We do,
interact.
and I can actually, since we have a few times, I'm going to go off script here a little bit. I'm
Do it.
hosting. I think I'm hosting 3 or 4 community conversations this week. Ironically, it's just the way it worked out. One is on a geo bond tax that we are trying to get passed in the City of Independence, and I'm going around to some HOAs and some business associations, and those are your pretty standard, like Tish talked about, community conversations where we're really just trying to relay information and have people understand where the tax money is going. But I'm also in the neighborhood I live in, where there's a small, very fledgling nonprofit where they're trying to acquire an old community theater, and they're going to need to do a lot of fundraising. And I was asked to come and host this community conversation. And during that process, um, I asked who was being invited to the conversation. And it came to my attention that there was a local theater group who's losing their space somewhere else in the city, and that they were that they thought that they were going to be difficult, that they were already upset they were losing their space, and so this group didn't want to invite them to the table. And I said, why would you do that? I mean, that to me that only pushes the relationship further away than brings people closer together. And so I told them that I would happily host the community conversations, but that I wanted to make sure that this group that they thought was going to be difficult was definitely invited, because I think by not inviting someone, you only create further divide. And so that's another example of thinking about your invitation and who you're inviting. Go ahead, Tish.
No, keep going. I'm sorry. Finish your thought. There's a good question in the chat I'd like
Well,
you to
go
address.
ahead, ask it, because I think I was done. I was just rambling.
So, Village Moms says it's a thin line when you are, and she's absolutely right. It's a thin line when you are engaging those that are vulnerable and delicate. Are there some tips? Sorry, it just went away. Some tips that we could address for engaging people without reopening those wounds.
Yeah, I think again, some tips we already shared with you, but not coming in thinking you know what's right or what's going to heal them. I think sometimes the best practice is just sitting and being silent and listening.
Mhm.
Creating activities that are helpful for growth and communication, but maybe don't necessarily tackle that tough subject.
Mhm.
And then wait for them to be ready to share and ready to come out of their shell. I think that's really important. I can talk about another situation here. I have a long-term project where I bead these quilts with the blind. I use a kid's toy. It's fused beads where you put them on a pegboard and you put the little beads down and then you iron them. I'm sure many of you have seen this if you have children or not. And people who have visual impairments can feel each peg, and so they can make a design. And then I save all those designs and I make these giant patchwork quilts that really highlight, again, what people with disabilities can do. I wish I had a picture to show you because they're quite lovely. But I was working with a woman who wanted to help run the project. She didn't want to just be a participant. She wanted to help set up the beading sessions and go, and she wanted to be the facilitator. And so her and I had this great partnership. And for a long time, for several months, I'd pick her up and we'd get in the car and we'd go to these events and we'd bead, and everything was in plastic bags with Sharpie written on them. And uh one day I pick her up and she's carrying this big box. And I was like, what's that? And she goes, I got a bunch of pictures from the dollar store. And she had put in large braille print and in these little pictures all the beads. And she said, when we go to facilitate, you just take over and do all this because you're quicker than I am. But I said I want to be able to participate, and I can't do it in those plastic bags. And so it felt at first like an insult to me. But what I really needed to do was step back and listen and allow her that opportunity to go forward and be able to help in that way. And so those are kind of two ways I think you have to just be open to feedback as well.
I think another principle in dealing with vulnerable audiences is reaching people where they're at and including them to the level that they're comfortable. So let's take, for example, let's say we've seen a real rise in domestic violence in our community in a lot of those police calls. So maybe we talk with the director of a domestic violence shelter and get that person's perspective and say, do you have any people that might be interested in talking with me about what we might accomplish through a community forum? What is it that they would like to see happen? What role would they like to play? We've done opioid and heroin forums where all I do is organize them. I don't speak because I'm not an addict, but we've had moms. I had an 11-year-old child contact me that wanted to speak. We had somebody from the hospital, somebody from law enforcement. We brought in different perspectives around that issue so that as a community, we could get a better handle on it. When we were talking about domestic violence, we initially talked with law enforcement. We had a meeting with them, and they essentially told us there's no problem, and they stopped reporting these incidents as domestic violence, and our domestic violence rates suddenly dropped. Do I think that domestic violence as an action stopped? No, they just stopped reporting it that way because we drew attention to it. So I do think that reaching out to certain people, engaging them in conversation around the issue, people with knowledge in a thoughtful, sensitive way, maybe one-on-one, and inviting them into the process. Do they want to help design the process? Do they want to talk? Do they want to lead a small group conversation? And let them join in a way that is comfortable and empowers them. So I hope
think the
that
other thing that I
answers.
thought of that would be really helpful to share today is when you're thinking about hosting a community conversation, the location you use is really important. So
Yeah.
I've done a lot of community conversations with municipalities and different cities, and they say, oh, we'll host it at the police station. They have a big conference room. Well, maybe not everyone in the community is comfortable going to the police station for various reasons. It could be reasons of immigration. It could be that they've had trouble past or whatever. Or we'll host it at City Hall. Well, maybe that's where you also go pay your parking tickets, right? I mean, it has a bad feel to people. And so the building and the space when you're thinking about your invitation and going forward in your community conversations can also be equally as important because you can do everything right and then turn people off because the space has a negative connotation to some of the participants, maybe not all of them. And so it's really helpful to try to find a neutral ground, a local nonprofit, maybe a community center or something that doesn't feel very territorial, and especially something that's not, if you're having a community conversation and it's 2 or 3 groups that are disagreeing or want to come to consensus on something, hosting it at one of the group's sites is probably not the best idea. It feels like there's a leg up. It feels like there's an advantage. People feel that they're not in a safe space. And so you're not going to get as good as results. So that's just something else that popped up in my mind that I think is worth mentioning.
GK, we've got a couple more questions here. I'm going to go first on this one. We'll switch back and forth about inviting overworked small business owners and operators. How do we help them get engaged? And I think the first point with that is going to talk to some small business owners that you know and ask them, what is it going to take for you to get into a conversation with others around this issue? Maybe it means getting on the agenda at the chamber meeting, someplace they are already at. Maybe it might even mean, having some interviews, or they don't like surveys necessarily, but really engaging them. What is it going to take to get your voice into this conversation?
Yeah,
Your
I
turn.
would have said the first thing, especially being more unconventional. If you knew you were going to host a large
Mhm.
community conversation like next Monday, and there's a number of people that can't do that because that's when their business makes the most money for dinner or whatever is going to happen, you might go solicit their feedback ahead of time so that they feel that they were involved. Maybe you can post, with their permission, of course, their feedback on the wall or something, so that people in the community know that their voices were heard and held at the session, but they couldn't physically be there. So, I think extending some sort of creative way to bring them into the room without having them physically be there. Maybe they Zoom in because it's too difficult to leave their business fully, but they want to be they want to try to participate as much as possible. So I think there's always, I think, room for creative conversation, creative ways to include people.
We've got a really good question here too about how do you maintain safety within a community gathering without having to involve security. It's difficult to gauge personality dynamics in open community settings. You're absolutely right. I think my answer would be you may have to involve security, but that can be subtle. I have had some very hot button public forums, including candidate forums for an election. And when I have any kind of inkling that there may be trouble, I will ask law enforcement to come and be in the back of the room, to be a presence. Maybe they will come without uniform. You can kind of negotiate that based on their experience and what you think might be the concern. The other thing is not having a free-for-all forum, but controlling the way people interact. Do they need to write down their question? Do they need to come to a microphone? Having some control so that no one takes over your conversation. That being said, on very rare occasions, if you have a group of people who are um, being noisy and disruptive and they will not leave, end the meeting, take away their stage and their platform. It's unfortunate, it's very rare, but we don't want to allow those people to be disruptive. I will say there may be occasions where you say, do you have a representative that would like to come up here and participate in this panel, to be a part of the group? Again, don't automatically send them away just because they're feeling not represented. You kind of got to weigh that a little bit, but security is very important for some of these conversations because people need to feel safe in order to participate. So I would have that conversation with your organizing group and with possibly even with law enforcement, because sometimes they know more about what's percolating under the surface.
Yeah, I also think if you've done some of your legwork ahead of time, you've taken the time to really work on crafting how you're inviting people, and you've built some trust in the community, that there can still be some heated conversations without the need for security. And I understand the fear to need that. And so I don't think you're wrong by asking that question by any means. But I think some prep work ahead of time can help diffuse some of that before you even get there. Another way that I'm gonna this coming community conversation I'm hosting in a couple of days, I'm going to be informative with a few slides, and then I'm going to, instead of having an open forum that can get out of hand and people say ugly things, I'm going to have people more turn to their neighbor and talk amongst themselves, and I'm going to allow a space where everyone gets to be heard. But to be heard, you have to write your ideas on a sticky note and put them on the wall. And so, I think it's also important that you never want your audience, whether they're disruptive or you disagree with them, to leave like they felt like they didn't get time to share, because that just boils up in people. And so, and you can't let people share for half an hour or 10 minutes sometimes, even if there's 200 people in the room. So you have to limit their sharing ability, and you can do that by having other activities and places they can share. So you always want to make sure everyone feels like they've been heard. Just,
right.
I don't know if we have another question, but we have 5 minutes left, and I just wanted to see if you want to get to that video.
No, I was just going to say that Nick will send this out and you'll have our contact information. Feel free to contact either GK or I about Community Conversations. And then I think Nick is going to show us that short video.
So and there's a couple more of these online. This was the shortest one we could find for our time frame. We didn't just want to show you a video during the webinar, but this is Candy Chang talking about one of her projects around community conversations. Do I have to stop sharing?
No, I overtook it. So
Okay, great.
I want to redefine the ways we use public space to share information that's important to our neighborhoods and also our individual well-being. One of my latest projects was inspired by vacant storefronts. There are lots of them where I live in New Orleans, and there are also lots of people who need things. My neighborhood is still without a full-service grocery store.
Bear with us, folks.
So I
We all
made
know
these
how
fill-in-the-blank
technology can be.
stickers to give us an easy tool to voice what we
can
want,
hear.
where we want it. You just fill them out and put them on abandoned buildings and beyond.
We got nothing, Nick.
The stickers are custom vinyl, and they can be easily removed without damaging property.
I hear it fine. It's plain.
Oh, is it?
So
Okay.
I put boxes of free stickers in businesses around the city, and I posted grids of blank stickers on vacant buildings, and I was really amazed by the range of thoughtful responses. From a butcher shop to a nursery, from a community garden to heaven. It's a fun, low-barrier tool to provide civic input on site, and the responses reflect the hopes, dreams, and colorful imaginations of different neighborhoods. So some people want better infrastructure, like roads properly paved, sidewalks repaired, and bike lanes installed, bike racks installed. And some people want better food, like an affordable farmer's market, a taco stand, real soul food, or an entire building covered in bacon. Some people want smart places like a chess club. Some people want sexy places like a strip club. And some people want both smart and sexy places full of nymphomaniacs with PhDs. Some people dream of being somewhere else, like a hammock on a beach, or Pittsburgh. And some people dream that somewhere else we're here, like my mom's house, or Brad Pitt's house. Some people dream of making it their own, like Keon and Kaylin's seafood place, my art gallery, my produce market and cafe. And some people dream of making it together, a bakery. If you can get the financing, I will do the baking. And that brings me to the larger question. What if residents had better tools to shape the development of their neighborhood? What if we want the same thing? What if we could prove that there's a strong enough customer base for a new business to open, or push local entrepreneurs to the next step? And what if we could better share information to make all of these things happen? So that's what I'm working on right now, a digital version that takes the same idea a few steps further and will help residents self-organize around shared desires and goals. But where better to start this conversation than in the very public spaces that we share every day? A public space where you can easily say what you need and join forces with people who want it too, so we can make our neighborhoods more ours. Thanks.
Okay, apologies to GK, who was the only one who couldn't see it or hear it. I hope everyone was able to do that, participate as well. We will include that link to that particular video when we send that out, or you can just Google Candy Chang on either a TED site or even YouTube.
Well, and I hope you
Trish,
guys
good to see you.
appreciated.
Sorry, I got excited. Trish Ertzfeld from Perry County.
Well, I hope you guys appreciated the creative approaches to community conversations, because I think there's the traditional posted notes, and I think there's other ways that you can structure it. So thanks for listening this afternoon.
Awesome. Well, thank you, GK and Tish, for presenting today. This is our final workshop in this series, but we'll be back. Stay tuned to our website and social media. In August of this year, we're going to be hosting another in-person capacity building workshop in conjunction with our AmeriCorps program that we're launching. And then we're hoping also to continue doing these virtually after that. I want to say thank you to all the instructors and attendees for this series, for making it a huge success. And I hope you all have a good rest of your day.
Thanks, everyone. We love what you all do.